No, Phelim replied. I think Domhnall believes so, however. A couple of words passed between him and Uonst, too quick for Osrith to hear. But we are loyal, Phelim said. We decided to join him, fire for him anyway. Yet, Greogair is Pictish, is he not? And Domhnall your Gaelish enemy? This time Uonst pushed past their leader. And that's as might be, girl. But Phelim has been made Lord Phelim when he knelt to him at Scone, the very centre of the Pictish, Dulriadan and Strathclyde territories. Uonst weighed the sword between his hands. Did you know that, in all the things you know? Did you know Sained Mackay Tildil Pin had equal Pictish and Gaelish blood? Osrith said nothing for a moment, but lowered her sword. Lord Phelim, if you swear you are for Domhnall, not Greogair, go, then, and fight for the king. He was causing division for he sought Domhnall's throne. And this was just part of that. Phelim turned and looked over his shoulder, his blonde yellow hair swinging in the cold midday, nodding to his men, then pointing with his sword. You honor your king well, Bernician girl, Phelim acknowledged, emphasizing her origin. The Picts had lost their land to Osrith's ancestors when Ido invaded. He turned and led the men across the hard path of frozen mud to where Domhnall was. When they were far enough ahead, Osrith followed. She could keep her eye on them, attack if necessary, and approached the battlefield. The fight seemed to have come to an end, Osrith thought, as she stalked behind the Pictish warriors. Few battle sounds could be heard. No clashing of blade or roaring of warriors. Getting to the clearing, Osrith soon saw why, and recoiled at the horror. So many dead, on both sides, so many fallen. Now, men from both sides were collecting the bodies of their army, clearing the battlefield of their comrades, of their warriors, whole or in pieces. Was it over? If so, who had won? Osrith scanned the field as best she could. No Norse, if any. Clearly Siegfried was playing a numbers game, allowing both Cymric Gaelish armies to diminish their warriors before being attacked by the Northman army, full rested and fresh for the fight with whichever army was victorious. Which was not clear. It was not obvious if one side was triumphant, or whether the battle was over at all. There seemed to be a break in the fighting. Many men, presumably Strathclydians, had fallen, and men who Sained had marched out that morning. Sained was clearing the field as was a general, presumably of the Ochades, was doing the sake for their warriors. The conflict had been bloody, and costly, and it was not over, for more Strathclydians flooded from between the trees to the clearing. Bue's handle was in hers as she surveyed the battlefield. Apart from the blooded bodies, or parts of bodies, for the dead or dying, warriors stood about in groups, each around one man. And the one man around who a group of some particular men were gathered was Domhnall. Osrith saw Greogair first. Beside the king, he was talking, pointing towards the woods, then back to the castle. Domhnall then stepped around to speak to his men. One man, Constantine, Osrith presumed, who was a little shorter than his cousin, and much taller than she remembered. No longer did he fight in the armor he used to have, that Osrith fought in, disguised as him when Domhnall killed Ivar the Boneless. He looked as magnificent as his Domhnall too, and his other cousin, Domhnall, who was standing on Constantine's right, waiting patiently. She also knew Fergus and Dagd's shape, standing as they were, on the other side of Domhnall, and it was suddenly clear to Osrith what Domhnall was trying to do. Reform the fighting line so they could continue to war against Eochaid. She would have to wait, Osrith told herself, wait until he gave himself away. Behind her, the fighting had begun. Osrith could see the Cruithin led by Phelim, slip into Domhnall's ranks. They were true to their word, at least. Next to Domhnall, Constantine fought. It had been little more than a year before Domhnall had been berating Constantine for his lack of skill. She had not seen him at the battle behind Combesil's monastery at Doiaya. But now he was magnificent, anticipating his opponent's moves. A feint here, a duck and parry there. All Sained had taught him had finally come together, as a chrysalis causes a caterpillars to come together to become a butterfly. A thought at the back of her mind caused Osrith to look something which was not right. A spear brushed past her head and into the shoulder of the warrior next to her. Osrith ducked, striking a Strathclydian in the back, pushing Buey deep between his shoulder blade. Her blade came out easily, and the man thumped at her feet. But, no, something was still wrong. As the men reassembled, Osrith noticed Greogair was not with them. Instead, he was heading towards the forest, in the direction of the settlement. Osrith wiped Buey on the grass and followed him. The dense wood gave Osrith ample opportunity to desert the battle and follow the traitor. Along the path of frozen, mulched dead leaves she trod, ice crumbling beneath her foot, which might otherwise have signaled to a more alert man that he was being pursued. But Greogair did not turn. Instead, he pressed on, to where villagers were not. Battle, so most were barred within their homes. Or, Osrith noticed, within the church. Outside its tall, wooden doors 2 monks were speaking to one another. Osrith did not recognize either. They were in discussion with Greogair as villagers were entering the church, children to hand, belongings wrapped in cloth. Was one of them a family of heathen? Bark's family? She hoped so. Osrith tried to edge forward to catch some of their conversation, but even on this cold, clear day, their voices didn't carry as far as to where she was hidden. She tried to creep further forward as monks joined the villagers in the church, but it was pointless, for Greogair was striding off towards the battle again. Both monks, an abbot perhaps, for he held a tall staff with an intricate carving, at the top, then entered the church, closing the doors behind them. That was shrewd, Osrith thought, as the battle behind them increased in its intensity. The Gaels were screaming and crying their charge. The Cymri of Strathclyde were using horns to incite fear into their enemies. Those in the church would at least feel safe until the end of the battle, and someone from the winning side could inform the monks that it was safe. So, it was under the delusion that the church was safe when everything was safe that Osrith missed what Greogair did next. If she had realized in time, perhaps she would have been able to stop him. But she couldn't get there in time. Once she had seen him throw a rag into the church, which immediately exploded into flames. Before she could get there, Greogair had gone, and the sound of screams had begun. It was only later Osrith realized that at least one of the 2 men Greogair had been talking to must have been complicit, for the door was barred on the outside, and the windows nailed shut. Screams came from the wooden building as the flames took hold. There was no stream or water she could see, and Osrith ran about the building, trying to see a way to break in. The fire had not taken hold on the eastern side. Little wind was around even in that open clearing, and the main fire was consuming the oak timbers and excreting ash as it feasted. The screams of help were heartbreaking. Standing as near as she could, Osrith shouted into the burning building. "How many of you are there?" A man's voice came from inside, and a face pressed against one of the barred windows. She could just see his cheek and one eye, and part of his ear-to-ear tonsure. 3 dozen. He shouted back, "Who did this? Do you know?" "Greogair MacDougall." Osrith betrayed. That touched Dean Abbott. The man raged. "I thought he was in the pay of someone." "We just spoke to Garrick." "Yes," thought Osrith grimly. "I bet he was the one who barred the door and ran off." She told the monk, whose name was Omar, this. "We can't get help. There is no way out." Osrith stood back and tried Buey against some of the nailings. Nutji were hard as iron, having been tarred in place. She tried the door, but was not strong enough to wrench the fixings free. "I will get help, Omar," Osrith shouted, Resib back round to the northeast wall. And, behind her, a second eruption of roars and steel clash came, and she realized, the Norse had held back to await a weakened field and were now engaging. How was she to help those in the church? Everyone who could help her in the battle. But, there had to be someone. Charging through the field, she sought someone, anyone, who could break down the church door or wall. Behind her, a swipe of an axe felled a dense Gruithin warrior of Philims that she recognized from earlier, slicing the man's body from shoulder to hip. She plunged Buey into his groin. The Norseman staggered, but towards Osrith, who cut towards his arm. He dropped the blade, then staggered to his knees. She wasted no time in plunging Buey into the back of his neck, pausing briefly as the smell of burning wood diffused into her nostrils. Osrith needed to find someone to help. but there was no one who was not engaged in combat. A step behind Osrith gave away the plan of another Norseman, which was presumably to kill her. She turned, Bue ready for victory. The Northman came at her, too late for Osrith to move, and parried her sword with his, knocking it from her hand. Osrith ducked as he swiped at her with a horizontal blow, which was half an inch from her scalp. As he swung round for another attempt, Osrith sprang for her blade, twisting on the ground. He lost focus for a moment. Osrith was up again. Then she saw the eyes of her opponent, bright blue, and knew exactly who it was. Eric. He saw her, but it was too late to avoid his blade, and it came down hard on Osrith's back. With a groan, she fell on all fours. It should have killed her, but perhaps he had recognized Osrith, too, and done what he could to deflect the blow. If he had recognized Osrith, Eric Thurgilson did not show it. She reached for Bue, but he kicked it from her hand, and was about to drive his sword into her gut. But the stroke of death did not come. A man stepped over her with one foot, striking Eric's blade out of her way, and fought him. Constantine was no longer a young boy, and he was canny, swift and devious, where Eric fought with heart and strength, bigger than Constantine, and sought to tire him. But Constantine was not easily tired. If he took after Domhnall and Domhnall, he could and would fight for sustained periods, tiring his enemy out, with a cut here and a slash there, while being as quick and live as he had been at the very beginning of the combat. Osrith slithered from between Constantine's legs, and got up again, wielding Bue as the Norseman's sword was in a backhand lunge. Eric Thurgilson, she cried, with all her might. Eric Thurgilson. And unbelievably he heard her, turning away at the last moment with an obvious jerk. He looked right at Osrith, ready to bring his blade down on her. But recognition passed across his eyes, and he nodded his head very briefly, before continuing to battle Constantine. Just keep going, Osrith thought as loudly as she could to Constantine. You have the stamina and you can be beaten. And then she fled, because at that moment, Grioghair was also fleeing, towards the Stratclydians, and to a man, unhelmeted, who looked with his long black hair, long face and flowing upper lip moustache, almost exactly like Domhnall, the man who had hosted them at his palace at Glashku. It was Eochaid. Osrith searched the field. She was aware the church still burned and people would be, if they hadn't already, losing their lives. And she watched Grioghair, after a few brief words to Eochaid, tear across the field to a group of warriors. Her heart sank as Phelim spoke to him, and beckoned his men on to follow him, as he followed Grioghair, running after the man. And behind the crew within Picts followed Fergus, and tagged. They headed into the forest in the direction of the burning church. AMD hurried after them. Why was she watching Grioghair take men to the fire when it was the one who had set it? He and the abbot. What was he taking them to the church for? The only reason Osrith could think of was to diminish Domhnall's force. Catching up with the men, Osrith just had enough time to call out as they raced to the church. It was an appalling scene. Only in the merest, weakest way could the church be described as a building. Clouds of smoke bubbled into the air as flame billowed like the scorching sails of a ship. And below, there was precious little hull. How anyone could survive? Well. Osrith feared no one could. Tagged. Her husband turned round, his expression telling that he was certainly not expecting her. He's not to be trusted. I saw him fire the church. Osrith. I couldn't help it. She was about to use, as an excuse for not staying in the guard room. She could help it. She could have waited for him, as he'd asked. It matters not. Tell me later. I love you, Anglish girl. He looked at the stricken church. Now help me free these people. Whether anyone could have got past the front doors was doubtful, as they were outlined in red from the flames behind it, and were saved from consumption, and the inevitable influx of air which would have intensified the blaze even more. Osrith took tag to the northeastern wall, which was blackened, but was still holding up. Osrith called, and was sure she got a reply. Faintly and unintelligibly. Tail this, Tag demanded, thrusting his seeks into her hand before using the pommel of his sword to throw his weight against the wood. Holding his hand to his face, Osrith could see that the flames were channeling upwards, towards the converging roof beams and spire. Closer to the ground, bodies huddled, and Tagged began to push himself along the mud floor, slushy and dense, for the heat of the fire had softened the ground. "No!" Osrith screamed, as the flames licked around him. But she had been determined to go in, if she could have got in earlier. She used the seeks to hack at the wood, a frustratingly slow process. At the northwest wall of the church, Osrith could see that Fergus and Drest were making a similar gain, and there was, amazingly, movement from the bodies who had bundled themselves up on the ground against the inferno. And, as she was ready to pull out any persons that Tagged may get out, chipping away the woodwork, a kick came to her legs, sweeping her down into the mud. "You bitch!" The words were shouted behind her, and another kick came to her stomach. Osrith groaned at the pain, nearly toppling into the flames but managed to roll away, reaching for Buet. It was the abbot, with whom Griogère had conversed and whose name Emma had cursed. Osrith scrambled to her feet, and shot at him, anger and outrage overcoming her as she attacked him. How dare he be complicit in the deaths of so many people? Why do it? What for? It didn't take long to pound the man's face with Tagged seeks, before launching Buet into his stomach, giving him a far more humane death than he had given the poor people inside that devastated building. The flames seemed to be getting worse and, stepping over the dead abbot, she shrieked for Tagged, hacking at the raging building as the south side of it cracked and crumbled. Osrith ran back, clutching her head. The devastation was appalling. Yet, to the north, Drest and Phelim had managed to drag people from the church. Behind them, the battle continued as men screamed into attack, the battle cries of the Gales and the Cymric shattering the air. Osrith, about to strike at the church again, turned to look, and there was Griogère. Griogère was standing between the burning church, which was, against the odds, being liberated of its captives, and the woods. His face, splattered with blood and mud, turned downwards and looked at the abbot, before returning his furious face to her. It was Osrith who began the fight, running at her abuser, Buet raised. Though he was clearly intending to fight her, Domhnall's traitor was taken aback at her ferocious initiation of the conflict. He misstepped backwards as Osrith roared her battle anger at him, striking a chest blow, which he parried badly, driving his own sword under Osrith's arm, tearing into her jerkin, and drew it back, carving a hole into her flesh. "You bitch!" he screamed at her. "I will take your tits." But Osrith didn't hear him, and anyway, even if she had, she would not have responded. It was a waste of energy. Instead, as Sainid had taught her, she ducked under his arm, lunging for his back, swiping with Tagged's seeks across the back of his ribs. Griogère howled, thrusting his blade backwards, which missed one leg, but plunged into the inside of her thigh. "Don't kill him," Osrith thought to herself. "Give him to Domhnall, make him face his betrayal." With all her might, Osrith plunged her sword towards Griogère's own legs, slicing up into the hamstring. Those legs that trapped her against that wall. Those hands that explored her intimate flesh. That head which enjoyed humiliating her. Griogère fell, Osrith's blow incapacitating him as he fell to his knees. But he was not finished yet. Pulling at Osrith, Griogère caught her leg, toppling her onto him. Osrith could see he had positioned his sword point upwards and she was falling towards it. She twisted away, landing on his arm, and he pulled her towards him in a stranglehold. "If you only had come to me that night, you could have been queen of this whole country. As it is." Osrith saw him raise the sword, aiming at her chest. But she was not beaten yet. Throwing her head and shoulders up, she used her elbow to slam into his stomach. It was enough. Winding Griogère had caused him to puff, and stop his fatal blow, and Osrith rolled into the mud. Her own chest and stomach ached, but Osrith forced herself up. Griogère was trying to get up too, but Osrith was quicker and she felt for Tagged seeks, plunging it into any available flesh she could find. Griogère screamed as the blade pierced his left wrist, leaving him pinned to the ground. With Buet, she severed his right hand. Osrith panted, choking on the acrid smoke. At a slower pace, people were still being brought from the church, and she could see Fergus, his hair now black from soot rather than its flame-red hue, and Phelim's men bending to help out those trapped. The church now resembled a heathen offering, burning wood with the human bodies inside. Osrith called, still covering the agonized Griogr with her sword. Warrior. The monk called back. He stumbled towards Osrith. We couldn't save everyone, he panted, sweat making white lines through his soot-coated face. If it wasn't for you. Osrith shook her head. Guard this man. She looked down at Griogr, who was still writhing in agony, spitting incomprehensible words at Osrith. He is a traitor to the king. He is a traitor to his country. She paused, catching her breath. He set fire to the church and ran. Looked down at Griogr, who appeared to be trying to deny everything. I saw him throw a flaming rag into your church. And the floor had been soaked with oil by Abbot Jirim, added, grimly. Made out it was an accident. Then you see why this man needs to be kept incapacitated until the battle is won. Indeed. Boy, agreed, and, as Osrith drew back, the monk stepped into her place. At once, Griogr attempted to protest. Leaned across to him, and Osrith thought he was trying to listen to Griogr's words. Instead he stamped his iron-nailed boot heavily onto Griogr's face with a satisfying crunch. The traitor's screams ebbing from her ears, Osrith ran from the site of the former church. She needed to get back to the battlefield, to find Domhnall, to aid her king if the day was not already won. And, by the sounds of the clashing metal and men's cries of attack or in death agonies, it was still going. She emerged to a field of dead and dying, as Domhnall and many men fought on. To the west, Eochaid was screaming for men to join him and continue the fight, but from the edge of the woods, Osrith could not see more men for Eochaid. It took a few moments for Osrith to realize he was calling to Domhnall's crew then and any Cymric who had turned from him. None came. Any who might still be standing of those races did not acknowledge the call. Around them, the Norse were quitting the field, dragging away their dead and retreating into the forest. Men who had been fighting them tore after them in pursuit. Again, Eochaid called. But after a few moments of no response, and the king of Strathclyde charged the field in anger, his target, Domhnall. But, a fight never came. Behind the king of the Strathclyde Cymri, Constantine was holding the point of his sword. Over the dirt and blood and shit and mud he marched their cousin, forcing him upon his knees before Domhnall. She ran to the field, looking around. Eochaid's men were standing around now, those who had fought for him raising their swords in surrender. Osrith raised Buie as a warrior ran to her. He threw off his helmet, his face red with sweat that was dripping into his long black hair. It was Domhnall. The Irish prince grinned at her in triumph as Osrith lowered her sword, the one put up by him at Tara, which she had earned. We won, Osrith, he panted, loudly by her ear. And you are here. Domhnall remains king. We won. He embraced her to him, the battle triumph flowing through him, clapping her on the back, and she held him for a minute, sighing deeply with exhaustion. They'd won. Against the odds, Domhnall was still king. And she was there, not holed up in the Ophwick as the political wife of the king of Cumbraland. Behind them a cry went up. Osrith turned out of Domhnall's arms to see it was the monk, Brother Elmer, followed by warriors who had rescued the heartbreakingly few victims from the burning church. Osrith looked at Fergus, then followed the line, until she got to the survivors, before tracing her eye again. Something was wrong. But she had no time to think what, for Elmer had brought Griogr, handless and bleeding at his wrist, his face bloody from the kicking he had received. He, too, was forced down before Domhnall, throwing tagged Sikhs into the mud beside him. I am no traitor. Griogr spat, congealed blood escaping his lips. Eochaid, beside him, bowed his head. Domhnall, Osrith whispered, for the hushed arena of battle had fallen dormant still. Griogr ... He confessed he murdered King Constantine's father. Domhnall clapped both hands on her shoulders and looked carefully into Osrith's face. You are certain? Yes. And he told the abbot true that he sought the throne, not as kingmaker to Eochaid, but alone. Domhnall slowly removed his hands from Osrith, his face solemn. Then, he strode across to the king. As prince in exile, as Domhnall and Constantine had been, his status was no better than a lord. But he stood before Domhnall, and repeated, loudly, and clearly, what she had said. And a cold feeling of shock shivered through Osrith as Constantine and Domhnall looked across to her, giving her an imperceptible nod. They knew. They knew about Girika's Griogr. There was no astonishment in their features at Domhnall's news, no amazement. They merely turned back to Griogr, on his knees with Umma behind him. And, from the battlefield stalked Ruairi Cainbhilach, who had fought with Domhnall that day and had come all the way from Glenorchy with him. The chief of the Cainbhilach stood beside Domhnall and said the same. Wordlessly, Domhnall withdrew his short knife from his hip scabbard, hidden under his cloak. In the ebbing light of the day, light photons bounced off its polished surface as the king handed it to Constantine. Constantine looked over the blade, then down to Griogr, raising the knife over his head. It was his father, Osrith thought. Any second now, he was about to avenge him. But then he stopped, offering his hands, clutched around the hilt, back to Domhnall. Taking back the blade, Domhnall ran it into Griogr's stomach. With a thump, the traitor fell to the ground, mud splattering up from his impact. Domhnall took the blade, and on his blue cloak, cleaned the weapon. Here falls a traitor, a murderer of the innocent, Domhnall declared, addressing the field. This day is won. He turned to Eochaid, making sure his voice could be heard by all, and Osrith imagined the king of Strathclyde, now kneeling in supplication, and how the slave Guthard Harthknutson, now King Guthard, must have knelt to him. I will not slay my cousin, king in his own right of the Strathclyde Cymry. I reach out to Eochaid to approach me as Aethelwulpin kin. All waited. And then, Eochaid opened his mouth. As kin of Saenid Mac Aethelwulpin, first king of Alba, I cede, and offer true and unwavering loyalty to you, Domhnall Mac Corstin. A cheer erupted around them. Domhnall's men waved swords, shields, arms in the air. This is a day for celebration. The murder of King has been avenged. My cousin has ceded the day and we have routed the Norse. The cheer was raised again, hearty and prolonged, and the king beckoned to the warriors. Domhnall's triumphant forces gathered around the king as Domhnall offered his arm to Eochaid. Osrith watched as Eochaid paused for a moment, before wrapping his hand around Domhnall's forearm and the king around his cousin's. Domhnall then stepped forward, calling to the men, survivors who had been on the opposing side that day. Come, men of Strathclyde, my people. For this is a day your king welcomes you to his side. He glanced ahead, at the place where the Norse had fought and fled. His presence radiated around the battlefield, and Osrith marveled at Domhnall's presence, charismatic, just, easy to give your loyalty to. If she would but know it, Osrith would compare him to another, yet unborn king next to who she would stand on a battlefield. We, the men of Alba together, whether of Strathclyde, he nodded at Eochaid, of Pitland, at Felim, of Dol Riata. Together, the Norse will never take hold of this land, will never overrun it as the Danes have in the lands to the south. And then, his eyes met Osrith. 1,000 years passed between them in a second. Then Domhnall, king of Alba, nodded to her very briefly. Osrith's heart soared. Her lord had accepted her. All thought that she had been disloyal by escaping Caligulad flew from her mind. She looked about her, to Umma, to the dead being moved from the field for burial by the fortress's servants, to the line of injured being assisted, or carried for help. She could feel her face grow hot as adrenaline blushed her cheeks. She could find tagged, ask Domhnall's permission for them to wed, be with him, always. Then she saw Umma stride towards a line of people. Nuanced, dressed and Fergus, all black with soot particles were escorting them, her heart lurching. The survivors were so few. 36 went in, barely 10 stood between the warriors, some supporting one another as Umma crossed to them. Then, she looked across at their number again, trying to work out the obvious error. Boy! The shout came from the Umma, as Osrith scanned the line again. He brandished the Sikhs, tagged Sikhs, which had pinioned Griogr to the ground. Your Sikhs. Tagged Sikhs, Osrith thought, as the monk thrust it out to her. She smiled, looking at the warriors again. Fergus, now a black-haired Gael, looked away from her. He seemed not surprised to see her, and yet, He had looked away. "You fought with bravery for one so young. Who is your lord, boy?" asked Emma. "Girl." The voice behind her made her turn. "And she is King Domhnall's warrior." It was Sainid. Blood and mud was dried in clumps in his hair. It stuck to his armor and legs. Yet, his face was light and alive with mirth. Osrith felt her heart light as air. "We won," she declared. "Indeed," he replied. He looked past Osrith as Emma began to lead away the village survivors. A cold wind blew around them as the monk ushered them to come to the monastery. "And you go to meet the other survivors?" Osrith proposed. But Emma did not reply. No others survived. Sainid's hands took her shoulders. Osrith turned to face him. But Sainid leaned towards her, as the image of Tagd fighting with all his might to enter the inferno. His words were quieter, and she strained to hear over the noise of armor over newly freezing earth. "Did you no hear me, lass?" "No one." "Oh." That was all Osrith could say. "Oh." The battle was over and she was exhausted. Osrith stepped wearily towards the king's general. She put her head on his chest and head on his shoulder and, still standing, closed her eyes, too tired to move, too sad to cry. 88,888,888. The dark days of winter were lit with Domhnall's victory. That very night a feast was held in honor of the warriors, all warriors of the United Kingdoms, a land Domhnall named Azilba. For this land was once united against the common foe of the Latins, who built the southern wall.